Hey everyone, welcome to God's Plan, Your Part, Year 2, where this year we're reading through and studying the entire New Testament, one chapter at a time. Thanks again for joining us in discovering God's plan and your part in it.
Today we are digging into Hebrews chapter 9, continuing this thread of proving once and for all that under Christ we have a new and better covenant. Again, the author of Hebrews is speaking to Christian believing people of a Jewish background. The imagery in this chapter is very strong, and it continues to point to the fact that what we are doing now, what we are under now, what is happening now is newer, it is better, it is once for all, and it is effective. So excited to dive into this chapter, and I think, Jenny, you specifically were really resonating with all the imagery.
I was just going to say that. I do actually also just appreciate and I guess kind of like marvel at the idea of the original temple tabernacle because it was actually like our way to approach God. And what is so crazy to me is like all of the almost red tape to approach God. And like it was still possible, but for one man to do it on our behalf. But I do like the imagery going back and forth of how, although, yes, we had a high priest that was able to approach God and like offer sacrifices for the sins of the people, it is crazy to me how that was just like this cheap, almost, maybe not cheap.
Yeah, I wouldn't say
but
cheap.
But like a, not even counterfeit either, but it's, I don't know. I think of like when I was in college, I used to want a really nice handbag, and I got one that looked like the real thing, but it wasn't the real thing, and it was obvious that it wasn't the real thing, but I thought it was great. I don't know. So just this back and forth of like Jesus is the one who is like the ultimate sacrifice. Like he is far better and perfect compared to what we had to do this like copy of it almost.
I would call it foreshadowing. I think that's a little bit more of a way to capture it. It's that God was not surprised by Jesus. God was not surprised by the death and resurrection of Jesus. Jesus is God, so obviously he was not surprised. But all of these things that had been set up were put in place to draw attention to the fact that something better was coming. And so if you want to track this idea of blood covering sins, I would say like you can look back to the Exodus account of when the people are coming out of Egypt. They had to make sacrifice. They had to kill this lamb, and they had to put the blood of the lamb on the doorposts. So it was this idea that this house was covered by the blood of the lamb. Then you get into the law of Moses, and there's lots of laws appealing to blood, requiring blood for the sacrifice, requiring sacrifice and requiring blood for the covering of sins. The author here of Hebrews 9 is referring to the high priest needing to go into the Holy of Holies once a year, covered by the blood, but then he has to do it again every year.
Yeah,
there's
and
a lot
what's
of
interesting
imagery.
in verse 7, it says, but into the second only the high priest goes, and he but once a year,
Right.
and not without taking blood, because he himself also needs to offer for himself. And so that's where I kind of think that it's like, well, Jesus compared to some high priests in the Old Testament, like there's no comparison, I guess is what my thought process was. Like it's not the same at all. Like it's a copy, and it's like trying to be what Jesus is going to accomplish, but it's not the same thing. And so I really like that. And I also like the wording in verse 14. I think it was like overarching theme. How much more? Because we think of Jesus, how much more powerful, how much more perfect he is. Actually, he is perfect, period. So I like that. I think that part is it's really cool, and it helps, I believe, those people of that time to recognize like there is something better.
Mike Winger has a he's a YouTube guy. He's a theologian. He has an extensive series on Hebrews, and he talks about how Hebrews is like the key that unlocks the whole Bible. And so his whole case is that when you, like a lot of people talk about reading through the Old Testament and being confused by the structure of all of it and how it seems so different. Hebrews is unlocking, I think, and it's not me, it's him, Mike Winger, that makes the case, that Hebrews helps us New Testament people, I hate to even make that distinction, but people that know about the death and resurrection of Jesus, it helps us understand what all those Old Testament stories, all those Old Testament laws and requirements were requiring and leading up to. And again, I would use the term foreshadowing. We're looking forward to something that's coming, because like the tabernacle, it's not really the heavenlies. Like the tabernacle is like a shadow of a greater thing. The temple, it's not where God really dwells eternally. It's just a shadow of things to come. And so the blood and the sacrifice, again, because they had to continually do it, because these sacrifices for sins were cyclical, like they were required on a regular basis, they did not cover sin once and for all. But that should actually help us understand the fact that because Jesus gave his life and then took his life back up and conquered death, his sacrifice is once and for all. And you'll see throughout the New Testament that the writers are making the case that Jesus came, he is God, he conquered death, he paid for our sin with his blood, with his life, and now he has risen again, he has conquered death, and we can trust him. He is our great eternal high priest.
Well, I like you were talking about like calling us the new covenant or whatever you said. I usually didn't really like that. I did appreciate the wording too in verses 8 and 9, when he's talking about like the holy place is not yet opened as long as the first section is still standing, which is symbolic for the present age. Okay, so they're like still under this mindset that this is like what has to happen, but then Jesus comes, fulfills all of that, and then we're in like this new, almost like this new era. Our study Bible calls it like a new time of reformation. And it will be completed when Christ returns. And what's crazy about his return, the very last verse, he's not coming to deal with the sin of the world again. This time he's coming to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. So that's kind of cool too. Like, there's no confusion. He already came. He got the first part done. He was the part that the whole new, like Old Testament was waiting for. Now we are waiting for him to return again, eagerly awaiting him. Not to save our sin, or not to save us from our sins again, but to, I guess, be with us eternally.
I think something is really interesting, because I resonated with those final couple of lines as well. That Jesus is coming to return, not to what's it actually say?
Not to deal with sin, but to save those who are
because he's already dealt with sin.
Right.
So that again, the author of Hebrews is asking these Christian believers of Jewish background to persevere in their faith and not be fooled into nonsense. And so this is a first century Christian perspective, just one of, there are other ones, a first century Christian perspective on what it will be like when Jesus returns. And what I think is really interesting is that the final piece of chapter 9 is that Jesus is returning not to deal with the sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. So this audience is being encouraged to persevere in their faith, and the author is saying, hey, Jesus is coming back. There's no question he will return, but the purpose of his return will be to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. That's that original audience. That's also us. What's interesting to me is that when you think about the return of Christ, and if you think about like what, in contemporary times, what we think of as the return of Christ, usually it is that he's coming to destroy those who are wicked. But the author of Hebrews is actually saying he's coming to save those who believe in him and follow him and persevere.
Isn't that funny? Like, say the world goes on for another 200 years and they look back on this time, like, man, they thought like airplanes were going to come crashing out of the sky.
Oh, yeah.
And it's just kind of funny to think of how our time might be viewed.
I think it's very likely that the world will just continue on for quite a while. I also do believe that Jesus is coming back. Jesus will return, and we will rule and reign with him, and we look forward to that time. And I think that's what's sticking out to me, is that that's what the author of Hebrews was trying to say, is look forward to that time, because Jesus is returning for you and for your benefit. And a lot of times these like pop culture views of Jesus' return are airplanes falling out of the sky and death and destruction. And there's a reason I do say that this is one perspective of the return of Christ in the Bible. Obviously, there are other ones. The more famous one is probably Revelation, and it has a lot more detail than this. But this author of Hebrews is saying, hey, like, Jesus came, he paid the debt for sin. We have eternal salvation in him. He does not need to go back into the Holy of Holies every year and sprinkle with blood again. He has done it once and for all, and we can trust him and believe that his sacrifice has covered the penalty for our sin, and we have accomplished right relationship with God when we trust him.
I also, I don't know, I'm just kind of going back on this. Like, I think to go back yourself, or even listen at the end of this episode, to just really see all of the parallels between Jesus and the offering, Jesus and the high priest, Jesus and the heavenly places, like where he ends up. I don't know. I think it's really cool to see all of this, like all those like little phrases I used to hear as a kid growing up. He is our sacrificial lamb. That never like totally made sense to me as a child, but like it is so cool when you back up, you think of all these parallels, but also at the same time how they all fit together so well, and that we aren't this disconnected bunch from the Old Testament, because they were waiting for Jesus just like we are. Thankful and excited this side of things for what he has done and his second coming. We look forward to that. So I don't know. I just think it's really cool how Hebrews does kind of feel like it ties all of this together for us. And like I said, I would encourage you to go back and just really read through that. Like there's so much about how Jesus, like he didn't have to be sacrificed over and over and over and over again. Like one time, because his blood was pure, he went in as the high priest, as the sacrifice, and all of it was pure and perfect. So it's just cool. I really like it. It's fun to like dig into some of those details and parallels.
Yeah. And so I think, and we've probably made this case already, but as you read over the Old Testament, it's not disconnected from the New Testament. In fact, I think it's entirely unhelpful that we have split this into the Old and New.
That darn 400-year gap.
Yeah. So this is a continuation of what God has been doing. All of these things under the Old Covenant, under the Old Law, were foreshadowing of the things to come. Now we know what was to come. It's Jesus, and Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of what was being foreshadowed, actually as early as Genesis 3. And so this is not some new, crazy, surprising thing like, oh man, the Old Testament's dark and scary, and then we get to the New Testament and it's fantastic. It's not how this is. This is like a continually unfolding story, and Jesus is newer and better than all of the things that came before. It doesn't delegitimize the things that came before. It doesn't nullify the things that came before, but it does show that those things are foreshadowing of what was to come, and we can be thankful. And so your part for today, what do you got, Jenny? Do you have your part for today?
Well, I kind of said it for myself already. It's just really cool to go back and look at these things. Like, go back and look at those parallels. And honestly, to me, it just felt like this unveiling of how God has been consistent throughout, and he's been preparing us for his coming in the form of Jesus. And I don't know, it's really cool to observe those things and really reflect on how Jesus was that ultimate sacrifice. So if you have time to go back and do that, it's kind of powerful to, I don't know, see it for yourself, read it for yourself, and just reflect on God's sovereignty and all of it. So anyway, thanks for joining us today for this really packed chapter of Hebrews chapter 9. We'll be back again tomorrow with Hebrews chapter 10. See you then. Hey guys, if you enjoyed the episode today and are enjoying God's Plan Your Part, we would love it if you could help us in two ways. First, if you would give us a rating and review for our podcast, we would really appreciate that. And second, tell your friends, tell all your people that you rub shoulders with every day to listen to the podcast, and also give us ratings and reviews as well. That being said, here is the reading for today.
Hebrews chapter 9. Now even the first covenant had regulations for worship and an earthly place of holiness. For a tent was prepared, the first section, in which were the lampstand and the table and the bread of the presence. It is called the holy place. Behind the second curtain was a second section, called the most holy place, having the golden altar of incense and the ark of the covenant covered on all sides with gold, in which was a golden urn holding the manna, and Aaron's staff that budded, and the tablets of the covenant. Above it were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. Of these things we cannot now speak in detail. These preparations having thus been made, the priests go regularly into the first section, performing their ritual duties. But into the second only the high priest goes, and he but once a year, and not without taking blood, which he offers for himself and for the unintentional sins of the people. By this, the Holy Spirit indicates that the way into the holy place is not yet opened as long as the first section is still standing, which is symbolic for the present age. According to this arrangement, gifts and sacrifices are offered that cannot perfect the conscience of the worshiper, but deal only with the food and drink and various washings, regulations for the body, imposed until the time of Reformation. But when Christ appeared as high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, not made with hands, that is, not of this creation, he entered once and for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living God? Therefore he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that those who are called may receive the promised eternal inheritance, since a death has occurred that redeems them from the transgressions committed under the first covenant. For where a will is involved, the death of one who made it must be established. For a will takes effect only at death, since it is not in force as long as the one who made it is alive. Therefore, not even the first covenant was inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment of the law had been declared by Moses to all the people, he took the blood of calves and goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop, and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, "This is the blood of the covenant that God commanded for you." And in the same way he sprinkled with the blood both the tent and the vessels used in worship. Indeed, under the law almost everything is purified with blood, and without the shedding of blood there is no forgiveness of sins. Thus, it was necessary for the copies of heavenly things to be purified with these rites, but the heavenly things themselves with better sacrifices than these. For Christ has entered, not into holy places made with hands, which are copies of the true things, but into heaven itself, now to appear in the presence of God on our behalf. Nor was it to offer himself repeatedly, as the high priest enters the holy place every year with blood not his own. For then he would have had to suffer repeatedly since the foundation of the world. But as it is, he has appeared once for all at the end of the ages to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself. And just as it is appointed for man to die once, and after that comes judgment, so Christ, having been offered once to bear the sins of many, will appear a second time, not to deal with sin, but to save those who are eagerly waiting for him. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of God's Plan, Your Part. Don't forget, you can find us on just about every social media platform and YouTube. Let us know what you thought of today's episode, and if you have any questions, go ahead and post them there. You can also reach out to us directly at godsplanyourpart@gmail.com. As always, if you don't have a Bible, or if you'd like to use the one that we use, reach out to us via email, and we'll be happy to send one to you. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you again tomorrow.